Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Scott Stedman podcast. And today I am with Micah Current. Micah, how are you doing today?
Doing great. How are you?
I'm doing well. We are recording on Wednesday because we try to record on Monday, and that was a train wreck. So this
I
is
feel
take
like we
two.
should just stick to Monday mornings because when we do Monday afternoons or evening, it never works out.
It never does. No, it never does.
But
And
your kids went back to school, so the time has changed a little bit. So the window for which we can record, but that's okay.
yeah, it is because I have to get my son up. I get him up at early. I get him up at about 6:30. They get dressed. They have breakfast. Make sure they got all their stuff packed, and I walk my son to school. And then I come back, and then I pack my daughter's lunch, and then I walk her to school, which is where I work, and that's that. So yeah, it's kind of hard to do a podcast when you're always moving. So
Yeah.
before we begin on our topic today, Micah, what was the weirdest story you experienced this week? Or a weird story you like to share?
I think it's hilarious that we do this theme every week, and this segment every week, and I always forget about it. So like then when we go to record, I'm like, what's the weirdest thing that's happened to me this week? But then I can't remember, and so I think of some other random story. And when we were trying to record this the other day, we were sharing of like just we were talking about in-ears and we were talking about sound equipment and stuff like that. And so at one of the churches I worked at, we had in-ear monitors and we used click tracks and loops and had a music director in our ears telling us what to do and when to do it and all that stuff. And we also had pastor's mic routed to our in-ears. And so the congregation, when the front of house was muted, we could still hear pastor's mic if it was on. So like one Sunday morning we were going in, we had multiple services, and then before first service we're getting ready to go on stage and the countdown's going off. We're getting ready to start service and start worship, and we hear the bathroom. We're like, what the heck is going on? Why do we hear the toilet flushing? Sure enough, it was pastor using the bathroom, and we could hear it in our ears. Nobody else could hear it, but we could hear it. So it's a pretty weird story, but yeah.
Yeah. And it reminds me of a time when my wife and I, when we went on our honeymoon, we were on a cruise, and there's like this big bingo thing. And we don't really gamble or do anything, but we're like, you know what? It's this big thing. So we're in this huge auditorium, and there's one guy who's up there who's talking to people and he's reading off the numbers. And then there's another guy who had a mic on him. So in case if anyone called bingo, he could go and he could like communicate stuff to him. Well, that guy, since it was real early on, that guy disappeared. And then all of a sudden you just hear a zipper, and you just hear like and you just hear straight peeing. And the guy's like reading letters, and he just stops and listens and he goes, "What is that?" And then he realized what happened. He goes, "Oh, everybody be quiet." So everyone was silent. And then right when that guy came in, he goes, "Hey, you left your mic on." And everyone, this huge auditorium of people were just dying laughing. And that guy was so embarrassed. But yeah, my weird story, actually, it was when I was doing a youth retreat this past couple weeks back. And they had a service. So we're sitting in service, and it was, in this big auditorium, and we're sitting there. And then all of a sudden, there's a moment in the bulletin where they have like a kids kind of like, kids time to go to,
Their
they go to some class, or there's like, since it was at a Chautauqua, it's like, it was like in a different hall or something in a different building near the auditorium. So I'm like, okay, whatever. Well, then all of a sudden it got to that part, and the pastor says, "I'm like, hey, kids, it's children time." And then you just hear this guy start singing, and he's playing a guitar and blowing this harmonica. And this guy is walking from the back of the auditorium singing, and all these kids are following him. And he walks them all the way down to the front of the stage, all the way around to the bottom, all the way back up and out the door. And kids are going, parents are going. Some parents had tambourines and they're banging them. And I'm sitting here like with this goofy look on my face because I'm like shocked that this is even happening. And I couldn't tell you if I was just like what in the world was this? And like kind of like, oh, this is creepy, like Pied Piper type stuff. Or I was just shocked on how if I could play guitar, I would probably be doing the same thing. And I just said, I mean, this guy was just singing songs, he was making up stuff, and that's usually I always make up songs too. So I'll just be like, come on, kids, come to the children's church. Let's go, come to the children's church. Yay. So that's I had a very paradoxical feeling. I didn't know if I was disgusted and shocked by this, or I was just like super jealous that I couldn't do that.
You like the troubadour. You know what a troubadour is?
No, tell me.
A troubadour is somebody who writes music about random things going on in life in a small town, and they just walk around town with a guitar and they sing songs about what's going on in the town.
Oh, is that like the guy from like the Witcher series? He's like, toss your coin to your Witcher, whole valley of plenty.
I have not watched that series, so
Oh,
I have
you
no
have
idea.
not? You are missing out. That was like
The reason I know what that was because I had a mom and a sister who loved the Gilmore Girls series, and my wife and I have watched that too together. And they live in a small town in Connecticut, and they have a guy who rolls around town with a guitar, an acoustic guitar, and he sings songs about the town and what's going on.
if you're out on the road.
Maybe we could write songs about. Maybe we could write songs about NDAs, which is what we're going to talk about today.
Ooh, yes, we're going to be
cease and desist.
Yeah, we're going to be talking about NDAs, cease and desist letters. But first, I want to kind of talk a little bit about contracts, which I feel like within the church, contracts kind of either they are a contract or they call them covenants. So, Micah, what was your experience with either dealing with a contract or a covenant?
I've had
and maybe explain that to like what people who may not know what that is.
Yeah, so a couple of things, we'll start with covenant. So like there's the covenants that some churches require staff members, elders, deacons, trustees, whatever your church calls them, to sign, just saying that they won't do certain things, which would reflect poorly on the ministry and their views or ideas of the philosophy of ministry that they are. So like, for example, drinking is a great example of that. Smoking, gambling. I remember when I went to grad school in Anderson, they asked me to sign something about not gambling because they had just opened the casino in Anderson when I started seminary there. So like they had all their undergraduates and people that lived on campus sign a covenant saying they wouldn't drink, they wouldn't smoke, they wouldn't go to the casino, they wouldn't gamble, things like that. In the ministry world, I've only ever signed one, I believe, and it was just stating that I wouldn't drink or purchase alcohol, because that's one of the things the church didn't want to support. So yeah, I haven't. Have you signed any covenants or contracts or anything like that? Or
Yeah,
contracts are a different story because there's
contract. Well, I mean, I signed a contract. The only time I've signed a contract was mainly for salary. Like, here's your pastoral package, and this was kind of the agreed terms to, they had a package. Here's how I want it distributed, and then I signed a contract, and that was like my first year in ministry, and that at a church, and that was kind of, I didn't think anything weird. There was a time I did have to sign a covenant, and it actually was during camp. We had a couple of group from Answers in Genesis come to the camp to speak about their curriculum about evolution and creation and all that. And there were some people who were like biology students or who they're studying science, and that was like going to be their major. And they totally were like, we don't agree with Answers in Genesis's view of the creation story or anything else. But the director's like, everyone needs to sign this covenant to basically say that we're not going to interfere or we're not going to challenge like what they're teaching. And if you don't sign it, you won't have a job. Pretty much that was it. So for me, I signed it because I wasn't going to be teaching. I was going to be I had the role of um, digital. I was a digital director. So I went around and filmed everything and took pictures. So I wasn't going to be talking about evolution or creation with the kids. So I wasn't going to be sitting in those classrooms. So it didn't really pertain to me. So I'm like, yeah, I'll sign it because I wasn't going to do that. But I know for some people, they really debated if they were going to sign it or not because they thought, A, I don't agree with this, but B, I don't think it's right for me to have to sign a covenant saying that I'm not going to challenge or talk about something, especially when it's at a church or a church camp, because they feel like covenants are between man and God, or at least that's what one person explained. That's something between man and God that shouldn't be between, that shouldn't be made in a way that, oh, if you don't do this, then you're going to be disciplined or get fired. And they thought that that was kind of a pretty crappy move for them to sign this covenant.
Or in Matt Chandler's case, as we talked about last week, put on a leave of absence.
Yeah. Yeah. Matt Chandler. My goodness. Yeah. And I think even with covenants too, because I know there's one church I was pastoring where they asked their Sunday school teachers to sign covenants. And it was basically kind of the same thing like with elders and deacons, like, hey, be of good moral, good standing character, blah, blah, blah. But then also kind of, you are committed to be teaching this class for a year and you can't get out of it. And almost like you can't get out of it. And part of me, when I got there, we did away with covenants because I was like, well, if I have to like rope people in to teach, they probably shouldn't be teaching anyway. And B, if there's life circumstances that happen, I don't want them to feel like, oh, well, I signed this covenant, so I can't leave, even though my husband's been diagnosed with stage 4, like prostate cancer, and I got to be by his side, and I can't, but then I have to like leave his side so I can teach 5th graders Jesus because I signed this piece of paper saying that I would do it for a year. Like I feel like when you get into that territory, I would hope that churches would be more lenient and understanding, like, okay, yeah, like you can go, but I know reading some stuff within books and looking at case studies, it's not always that case sometimes.
Yeah, it's not always that simple.
No, it isn't. It isn't. And I guess my other thing too is at this point you should know your people. And if you know that these people love Jesus, that they are reading the Bible, they're participating, they're growing. You can see the spiritual fruit on them. I don't see the point in trying to say, okay, you need to sign this piece of paper saying that you won't do these things, because you're already going to know that they're not going to do anything. And if they do something, then, you and your elder board would then address it that way. You don't really have to sign this paper and then bring a piece of paper into it and see, you said you wouldn't do this and you did. How dare you? Like, I feel like it's just kind of almost like a invisible noose sometimes that doesn't need to be there.
Do you think we have to get to the point where we need to get over some of those things?
Yeah.
And we've talked about it. We've talked about it in other episodes, right? Like where some, I feel like I'm going to get a lot of flack for saying this, but like if we watch a live stream, for example, if we watch Elevation Church, if we watch, Bethel or whoever, it's depicted that these people are all just Christian Christ followers, and it just looks really good aesthetically, right? So like they're not really going to the deeper, heart of what people are actually going through, or what, because you don't know, because you're just watching it on a screen, right?
Yeah.
Or even if you look at those churches, for example, like you don't know what the person next to you is going through, and like there's 5,000 people in that room with you, and so like when we get to the smaller churches and small to mid-sized churches, like people are going through stuff, people aren't perfect, and do you like they're like there are certain circumstances where yes, you need to like hold people accountable for things, but like some of the little things, like if people are doing some of these little things that we get so caught up on, like Are we going to be the ones that say, hey, no, you can't serve? What if you pastor a church of 50 people and like everybody does everything? Like, are you just going to tell them they can't serve? Is that like, I mean, and I guess that's what I mean. Do you think there's a point like where we need to get over that and walk alongside them and show them the love and the grace of Jesus rather
Mhm.
than saying from the start of things, nope, you can't serve because you know, I saw you buying a case of beer in Kroger the other day. You know, like it just
Yeah.
we just have to get over some of that stuff.
Yeah, I think so too. And I mean, I think on the other side of that coin, I mean, if you're part of a denomination that's very hardline, with these certain like extra biblical rules, then you know what you're getting into. So I think that's kind of the other side of the coin. Like if I know if I'm in a Southern Baptist tradition, I know they have some hardline teachings, then as it's someone who's going to be a deacon or a bishop or a teacher, I'm going to have to know that, hey, this is it. And if I am struggling with something, I better repent, find counseling, do something to get my stuff in order, because it's probably going to get found out. Um, and it may cause a ripple effect, or it gets found out. And then, in other cases, the other side of that, the other side of that situation is it may get covered up too, which is, you know, we've been seeing a lot of that within like the Catholic Church, and even with Mars Hill, Willow Creek, and then also with the SBC too. So, yeah, so let's kind of shift focus to NDAs, non-disclosure agreements. Have you ever had to sign an NDA or
No.
participated in churches that had NDAs?
Um, not to my knowledge. I've worked in several different types of churches, and I have yet to have to. Um, but we've heard more so recently, and like especially in the Hillsong documentary, where they make people sign a lot of those.
Mm-hmm.
Have you had to do that?
No. Like I mean, I didn't find out what an NDA was until I read A Church Called Tove, and reading some of the accounts where not only church staff, but even just members, like when you sign a members covenant, that there's also a non-disclosure agreement too on some like bigger churches. And I'm thinking, yikes, like that's insane. But no, I've never had to sign a non-disclosure agreement.
And I want to get into some other things I've had to sign later on, but I've never had to sign an NDA. But they they hit this pretty hard when we reviewed the Hillsong documentary, um, just about what they were expected and why they were expected to sign those. I know that Crossroads Church here in Cincinnati. I know that when you apply for jobs there, there's a thing called the I think it's like the I Trust covenant. Like they have a covenant that you sign for Crossroads, and it has like the top 10, you know, their pillars of faith as a non-denominational church. But it's like, you know, it's very much driven towards like we're not going to be judgmental about drinking, and we want to be inclusive, and we really have a lot of diversity, and you have to love everybody, and like it's pretty open ended, but you have to. It's the I promise. It's called the I promise agreement.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, I've never had to sign anything like that, thankfully, because I don't know that I would.
Yeah. And I think the problem with non-disclosure agreements, and there's a case, and I wouldn't necessarily. I talked earlier about even members signing. I know there is a case study in church called Tove, where there was a family that started attending Village Church. And I'm not sure if it was the one that Matt Chandler was the pastor, if it was like an extension or a satellite church that was from Village, but they attended this church. They liked it. They signed this membership agreement. And one of the things was, they had things that you couldn't say or you couldn't do, blah, blah, blah. And then their child went to a summer camp that was run by Village. It was kind of sponsored by Village, and it was mostly Village staff and volunteers that ran the camp. And obviously there was something there was a situation that happened that the family wanted to pursue legal charges, and initially they went to the elder board and said, hey, this happened to our daughter. We want answers, we want investigation. And the board kind of was like, well, this person's really good, and I don't think they would ever do something like that. So they kind of dismissed it, and they felt like they couldn't lawyer up because they signed this, this NDA, and they also signed this that was tied to a membership covenant. And a family member said, well, leave the church. I just say you're leaving the church, sign your document saying you're no longer a member of the church, and then after that, lawyer up. So they did that, and they're able to lawyer up. And when they talked to a lawyer, they said, anything that's like a felony, like what happened to their daughter, NDA is not going to, an NDA is not going to prevent you from speaking out when something is a crime or a suspected crime. So, they didn't have to feel like, but they felt bad because they just waited months and months for something to happen, and the church dragged their feet, and then they did that. And then even like with the Mars Hill podcast that Christianity Today put out, there is pastors who they were told you have to sign this NDA, you can't say anything. And if they didn't, not only did they not get any severance, but then their insurance was cut. They were completely cut. And sometimes, at least one pastor said they weren't going to sign it, and they walked away not signed it, and definitely didn't get their severance pay or their 6-month extension for insurance, like lost everything because of that. And then luckily there are some people in the church who found out about it, and they were able to give them money, able to do a GoFundMe thing and raised all this money. And then eventually the church gave them their severance, because there's probably, oh, well, the church people are doing something for them, I guess we have to, so we don't look bad, which is basically probably what it was, is more of a PR move than anything. But yeah, and really, my opinion, NDAs shouldn't be in a church. I mean, I see NDAs not being part of a church, just like when some churches want to like sign petitions to like remove staff. Like, to me, I think that is like not biblical, not gospel centric, not bearing the image of Christ when you have an NDA or a petition or anything like that. So
yeah, I mean, I would agree. I think that, yes, there's a point. Accountability is important, but there's also a point where people take things too far. And even without things like NDAs and covenants and contracts and other things like that, where church people take the liberty and they take it too far. So like, even without those documents, you and I know, all too well that church people can take things way too far without those documents or the threat of those documents.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's messy. So then the other thing that we see some churches do are cease and desist letters, which I find weird, because normally when you have a cease and desist letter, it's usually for any type of copyright or trademark infringement, which I think in some cases, like if you're using, I can see like a cease and desist order be happening, like if a church is, playing like a Chris Tomlin song and they don't have the license to play it, like a CCLI or something like that.
Play a video or something that's not theirs, and they don't have the royalties to it, or they've not purchased those royalties.
Or kind of the thing that happened in that church in Texas where they did a whole Hamilton production, but they changed it to be about Jesus and had the gospel in there, and they just kept going it. And luckily no one found out about it until it made national news. And then by the time when everyone got wind of it, they were ending their, weekend or 4-day run. So you couldn't really do a cease and desist order, but definitely there was a lawsuit that came right after that. So yeah. So I think in some ways, I've seen some churches have used cease and desist letters to kind of silence people. If people are saying, hey, I had this bad experience at, at this church, or my kid had this issue at a vacation Bible school, or maybe it might be a preschool that's being run inside a church. Like, oh, there is this big thing. Sometimes churches may send like cease and desist letters to shut people up. And so have you ever had to deal with any of that in your ministry?
No, no, actually, uh, to my knowledge, at least, my dad. I don't know that my dad has. Um, being in ministry for 30 plus years, I haven't.
Hmm.
uh, there are other documents, like if it's okay, like kind of switching gears a little bit, but like
Oh no, you're
I
fine.
um the first church I ever worked at full time, we were a decent sized church. I was creative arts and young adults pastor there, and I was in charge of those areas. And um, I was young, and it was my first job ministry wise. It was full time, and I I got hired on, and then the pastor hired me. So we had myself, office manager, youth pastor, children's pastor, lead pastor. The church was running, 250 to 300 people at the time, and things were going well. And then the lead pastor decided to leave, and several months went by after he left, and I had no idea what I was supposed to be doing. And I mean, I continued to do my job, but on Good Friday, uh, the chairman of the board called me and said, "Hey, can I meet with you?" And I was like, "Sure." I'm at the office all day. Come on in and we'll have a
You
conversation.
you
And
you were working on Good Friday?
yeah, I had to get ready for Easter, man. Um, but at the same time, I was one of there was only a couple of us that were full time, and so during that interim phase, the office had to be covered, and so I just did it. So the chairman of the board came in, and he basically set a contract down on my desk, and
Hmm.
it was like a list and a job description of all the things that they wanted changed since the other pastor had left, including what I wore on a Sunday morning, what songs I played on Sunday morning, how I played songs, um,
Huh.
order of service, office hours, keeping a time card of the hours that I was in the office, like all of these things. And at the end of it, it said if these things aren't improved in 60 days, we have the right to terminate the agreement, meaning that they were going to fire me.
Wow.
And so I signed it because I am 27 years old, not really thinking much of it because I'm like, what in the world am I supposed to do? And I think we had just gotten an interim pastor. Like that Sunday, that Easter Sunday was going to be the interim pastor's like first Sunday there. And I'm like, I don't know what to do. Like he had cornered me in my office and I had to sign this document saying, hey, you're going to improve on this. So anyway, long story short, like, and my wife, at that time, like we were engaged. We weren't even married yet. And so she was working on trying to find jobs here in Ohio. She was in South Carolina, and we were just young and in love and trying to figure out what we were supposed to do with our life and what God had for us. And we thought it was in this area at this church. And so ultimately I ended up resigning before they could fire me. Um, and it's very, not very many people know that story, right? It was just like
Hmm.
I had to do what I had to do to provide for my family and for what was going to
Hmm.
be my marriage shortly in a couple of short months. And so that's one example. More recently,
Hmm.
in the last couple of years, I mentioned working at a larger church in the Cincinnati area, and I had been there for 7 months, and it was in like the middle of COVID, so we were still pre-recording everything. My job was the video production guy, so I basically just during that season was just videoing everything, pre-recording everything, video announcements, intros for online church, outros for online church, any kind of bumper videos, and the sermons. So my job was to record all that, produce all that, edit all that, put it all together, and then have it ready for Sunday because we were doing pre-recorded online services at that point. And so 7 months into the job, I I get pulled into the creative arts pastor's office, and basically kind of the same thing that happened at the church before, but they gave me there was like this 3-page document of like areas they wanted me to improve on. And it was like, improve on this by this date, improve on this by this date. And like, it was 3 pages. And it was like, all those things were in like, I guess the realm of 60 days. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so like, they basically went through all the things with me that, and it was like almost everything that I was doing wrong in their eyes. And so they wanted me to fix it or change it or do it better. And at the end of it, the worship creative arts pastor signed it, I signed it, and then our boss, the executive director of ministry, signed it. And if I didn't improve on it in 60 days, that they were going to get rid of me, or they just were going to terminate the agreement. And so I signed that, and because they wouldn't let me leave the office until I signed it. And this is coming from staff. This wasn't like elders. This wasn't like board of trustees. This was staff, because we reported to, that was the way that the chain of command was reported. Mm-hmm. So anyway, we were a larger church, multi-site campus, and the worship and youth pastor was at the satellite campus. His wife had got COVID that week, and they had 2 little girls, and they asked if I could cover worship at our other campus, and I was like, absolutely. So in that moment, like I had led worship, and I sobbed my eyes out on the stage, and just felt like the Lord was releasing me from that, and that I didn't even need to fight that battle. And so instead of fighting, after signing that paperwork, I just decided, the Lord said, you're done here. And my wife confirmed it. I had prayed on the platform and was crying my eyes out, and I got off the platform. My wife's like, you're going to resign, aren't you? And I was like, yes. And went in and told my boss the very next week, and she was like, can you give us 30 days? And I was like, yeah. And so all that to say, I signed that paperwork, and I still have it. And it just kind of rubs you the wrong way, especially when you think you're doing a good job. Mm-hmm. And that's happened to me not only once, but twice, and in my 10 years of ministry. And so it's so different. And when people ask you why you don't trust people, or why you don't have a sense of belonging, and I don't know, like if you're feeling, post leaving your last ministry assignment to where you are now, like, I'm assuming things are still going well for you, but like, in my situation, it's very much like I feel like I'm just on pins and needles. And my wife and I, and we've shared this with the staff at the church there that we're at now, but like, we don't feel like we belong. We don't feel like we're settled. We don't feel peace about it, just because of all of our past hurt and all of our past experiences. Mm-hmm. And when, you just feel like, man, I wonder when somebody's going to whip out a contract and make you sign it, or an NDA, or get like a stupid letter in the mail or something. And it's like, it's very disheartening. And it's like, it's almost like post-traumatic stress syndrome. I've never served our country in the military, and I've never been to war, but like, it almost feels like, oh man, what am I going to do? Like, when am I going to do this? Or is it going to be the wrong thing? Is it going to be the wrong decision? And you're afraid to make a decision, and it affects your leadership.
Yeah, and I think it's hard to do, and it's hard to lead when you've had all these past experiences where it's people. And here's the thing, like, and I've thought about this a long time, looking at things like contracts, NDAs, cease and desist letters, or like your experience, like, hey, you need to sign this and you need to do these things, and if you don't comply within 30 days or 60 days or 90 days, then we're terminating your contract. To me, I just feel like
which is funny, Scott, because you don't, like, we talked about contracts, but in both of those situations that I mentioned, I never signed a contract. So like, what are you going to do? Just fire? Like, they kept saying terminate the agreement. I'm like, what agreement?
Yeah, what agreement? You didn't sign a contract. Yeah. And I think the thing that bothers me the most about paperwork, and most of, whether you have it on legal paper, whether it's official letterhead, whether it's a lawyer turning these documents in, or whether it's just a church typing up a letter saying, hey, here's this, blah, blah, blah. And it's not going to, it has about as much sway in the courtroom as, a fart from a 5-year-old.
Mm,
It doesn't focus on reconciliation at all.
right.
To me, like, if someone says, hey, you got to sign this contract, for me, it's like, well, wait a minute. What's going on? Let's talk about this. What, let's really get down to the real issue here, because right now we're not having a conversation. You're basically throwing a paper in my face saying, this is what you're going to do, or this is what we want you to do, and you must comply, which to me, that's not reconciliation. And I feel like the churches have gone this route, and I understand churches going this route because they want to make sure, well, we don't want to get sued, or we don't want bad press, or we don't want this, or we don't want that. And I get all that. But if people are hurting from your ministry, then it is the church's responsibility. It is the leadership's responsibility to build that bridge to reconciliation. Because if someone's hurting and you decide to say, well, no, you're the bad person, you're the one who, you're this, and here's the paper, and you signed this, and you did this. And I feel like it's almost like it's setting up that we are the church, we represent Jesus Christ, we can never do wrong. So if someone, whether it's a leader, whether it's a church member, whether it's an elder, if something goes wrong, it's on them, but it's not on our culture. It's not on the leadership. It's not on the rest of the leadership. It's not on any of us, because, we are part of the church, and you are, you're on your way out. So you're the one it's almost like you're the one who's leaving the faith almost. And that's not what's happening. People have been hurt. People have been, people have had bad experiences, or people felt like that they had concerns and their concerns weren't heard. And instead of saying, and even if you're listening to them and at the end of the day, you're saying, well, I understand your concerns, thank you for bringing it up, but this is how we're going to do it. This is how we're going to do it. Because, you're the pastor, you have final say, or you're the elder board, you have final say. You don't need to throw a document into this. Build those things, build those relationships, work towards reconciliation. I think the big problem is we just don't know how to reconcile, because we made everything so administrative, everything so legalistic, everything very Phariseistic, if that's even a word, that we're not doing what Paul has called us to do. That, when we are with Christ, he has given us this ministry of reconciliation. If anyone's going to reconcile, it's not going to be God. It's not going to be Jesus, but we as the church and we as Christians have the ministry to reconcile with other people. And if the church doesn't want to do that, then we are not doing our due diligence to live out the gospel of Jesus Christ, because we are not being peacekeepers. We are not being reconcilers.
Yeah. I mean, and that work of reconciliation is a wonderful thing. And like, that's one of my favorite verses, 2 Corinthians 5:19-21. And it says, for God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself, no longer counting people's sins against them. And he gave us this wonderful message of reconciliation, so that we are Christ's ambassadors. God is making his appeal through us. We speak for Christ when we plead, come back to God. And then it finally says, this is kind of going along with what you said, Scott, but it says, for God, and verse 21 says, for God made Christ, who never sinned, to be the offering for our sin, so that we could be made right with Christ. You know what I mean? Like that is just like, we get so caught up in the mundane, and here's a piece of paperwork. Yes, people may screw up, and yes, people may slack in their jobs, but there needs to be some grace. There needs to be a grace culture, because that person may be going through something. Maybe their marriage is a wreck. Maybe their kid has Down syndrome. Maybe their kid's special needs. Maybe they have a parent who's sick. And like maybe the church isn't in the healthiest of spaces. And they don't need you throwing a document in their face telling them how bad of a job they're doing, or if they're doing a bad job, because maybe they know. Maybe they know that they're struggling and they don't need you to throw that in their face on top of everything else that's going on.
Yeah, or even like an NDA or a cease and desist. Like if people are sharing their experiences and you're saying, well, you can't talk about it. Well, they wouldn't be talking about it if reconciliation happened.
Mm-hmm.
And again, like every case study I have read in my leadership, in my doctorate leadership program, and any of the other books that I look at church culture, usually a lot of times, if it's especially the person who feels like that they are the victim in this situation, they do go and try to reconcile. They do try to right wrongs. They do try to build that bridge. And yet it is other people who simply say no, or people who simply say, you're delusional, you're paranoid, you're this, you're that. So then, yeah. And I mean, and you
And
can't
then they
really
wonder
stop
why
people.
pastors, and they wonder why young pastors don't want to serve in ministry.
Or they want to know why, man, there all these pastors are leaving churches or whatnot, or why are all these people not wanting to come to church? It's like, well, because you are not being part of the ministry of reconciliation. You're not, if you're not willing to reconcile, or at least make the attempt to reconciliation, then you're not doing kingdom work. Period.
Mm-hmm.
I hit the gavel on the table. Boom.
I think you need a gavel.
I'm Judge Judy. Boom. Goodness. She's still around? I don't know.
Yes, she's still judging, I think.
Man, Judge Judy. Good night. Anyway, I think that's enough for my soapbox. Are you good with this topic? You want to talk more? I think we covered everything we need to cover.
No, I mean, I just,
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't change anything in my life, my ministry experiences, because I mean, those things happen and they do happen for a reason. But at the same time, it doesn't mean, they should happen. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like this is one of the reasons we record these episodes, is so that we can share our experiences, because things like that do happen.
Yeah. And
Pastors do get beaten up. Pastors
yeah.
do get, I don't know.
Yeah.
It's a struggle for me, and I'm very passionate about church health, and
Mm-hmm.
my hope one day, and my prayer, my wife and I were talking about this the other day, but like my hope is to really get involved in, district or state leadership one day, so that I can make a difference because of some of the things that I went through.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's kind of, even though my initial podcast when I started this was focused on the religious and entertainment and psychology, in a way to kind of have some fun, but also to, teach people and to influence people on, how to deal with some of these topics. And I think at least this past year, there's just been a lot of content just coming out of COVID, coming out of the Great Resignation, coming out of things where there's a lot of people who really need, just as simply the fact that they're not alone, that, you sharing your story, me sharing my story, it's helping them to understand their story in light of their situation and how God kind of is shining a light in those dark places.
Yeah. That's all I got. I just, I just want people to realize that those things do happen and they're not alone, because
Absolutely.
and it's a hard thing we call ministry, and people don't even realize it.
Absolutely. Well, friends, thank you so much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you have not catched any of our previous episodes, you can go back and check out all the hundreds of episodes that we have. So great stuff. Even some of the old ones I've done, which are probably not as great now when I think about them or listen back through them. But guys, thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for supporting this channel and this podcast. And I hope you guys have a wonderful week, and we'll be back on with a new episode. Take care.